Good morning. I am Jeff Englander. I'm the founder and principal of Healthcare Strategy Bullpen. It's my pleasure to welcome you back to Diagnosing Healthtech. Our co-host this morning is Carolyn Brinkerhoff. Good morning, Carolyn. You are in San Francisco.
Yes, bright and early over here. A little rainy, but still, it's going to be a great day.
It has finally stopped raining here in Connecticut. So it was a horrible day yesterday. Well, it is my pleasure to welcome Tony Clapsis. Tony is a board member and advisor. He's former president of clinical trial services at CVS Health. Previously, he led the enterprise strategy and corporate business development team at CVS Health. He was a professional staff member prior to that on the Senate Finance Committee, where he drafted some provisions of the Affordable Care Act and 6 other public laws focusing on insurance markets, provider payments, and delivery reforms. Tony, had a reputation as the go-to guy on the Hill if you really wanted to know the numbers, and that's not something I got from Tony. That's something I got years later from a lot of other people that knew Tony. Tony really had a wonderful reputation on the Hill. And I just learned that Tony was a reformed stock analyst like myself. So Tony, welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Jeff. It's good to see you. And thanks, Carolyn.
Can you tell us a little bit about your role at clinical trial services and what were some of the goals of clinical at CVS Clinical Trial Services?
Sure. We launched it about 3 years ago, kind of still in the midst of the pandemic. And there was at the time really obviously a lot of focus on COVID vaccine development, a lot of interest, I think, both from regulators and industry. And so I think, looking back, tremendous opportunity, I think, to start to address some of the pain points that were still being fed within COVID, but also to think about what some of those ongoing pain points and the role that a retail health provider, a pharmacy, a clinic, or others that have a community presence, could really start to kind of bring to bear in the marketplace. So we talked about publicly, we started sort of working with Moderna during the COVID vaccine and really closely kind of with the NIH as well. And then from there, really exciting few years in really trying to address, I think, a couple key points. One, how do you expand access to clinical research to all Americans, all communities? 2, how do you make it fundamentally easier for patients to participate? And I think the belief was if you could do those 2 things, obviously there's a viable business, that you could potentially run beyond that as well.
So Tony, 2 of the big things that, clinical trials always have a problem with are recruitment and retention, particularly for underserved communities. So can you talk about those things and also in the context of getting people to trials and making them more convenient and accessible for, some of the mechanics of those type of issues?
Yeah, so you sort of take a little bit of a step back. Obviously, from an equity perspective, there's historical reasons, why you tend to see more distrust in diverse communities around clinical research. And so I'd say that raises the bar really for anything that you're going to do to ensure it does come from a trusted source, and a source that is deep and consistently in the community, right? Coming in and out to run programs like this are generally not effective. But if you step back, and I'm going to simplify 30, 40 years of clinical research, as someone who's been in it really for 3, right? Generally what you've seen is research traditionally ran through academic medical centers, right? Mm-hmm. Over time, you started to see the rise of what we call site management organizations, or SMOs. Think of those as either independent or networked, dedicated research sites. Now those really popped up in part because AMCs have multiple things they're trying to do, inclusive of research, to the extent you need to sometimes get greater speed, greater efficiency, and sometimes greater focus. You had what was in effect these sort of specialists that kind of came around. So as you're thinking about running a clinical trial, whether you're the sponsor or the CRO, you're ultimately trying to put together a network of sites, whether they're in AMCs, community hospitals, multi-group specialty practices, or dedicated. And you're trying to ensure that you have the right collection of what's called a principal investigator, a PI, think of it as the quarterback in the site. And those sites bring patients really sort of with them. And that's been the primary modality or the buying pattern. I'm going to understand who the best PIs are, which patients they bring, and I'm going to try and create a portfolio approach that's okay, based on my understanding, I'm likely to kind of get to the right outcome. Well, if you do that, you have some challenges, right? One, historically, you didn't necessarily have these institutions as deep in the community as you would like.
Right.
So your universe is really starting from a place that has either a structural inequity built in, or just fundamentally is not in the right geography, or deep in the right kind of zip code. You're automatically going to start from a point in which you're unlikely to hit the kind of equity goals that you would have. There's ways around that. There's ways to address that. But there's a really fundamental structural issue with the distribution of research sites in the US that exacerbates a lot of your tensions, I think, really sort of around health equity. So one of the insights we've had, and you see this others in retail health and others that have kind of community presence, is really trying to address this notion that to attack kind of health equity, you really need to run and operate research sites that are in the community. It's not that, right? Just being in the community doesn't matter. So there's certain elements you need to look for, right? One is trust. That's probably the most important relationship. That trust could come from a health system or provider, could come from a clinic or a pharmacy, but you absolutely need to have sort of that element of trust. Two, you have to be exceptional at operating, right? Clinical research is hard. It's harder than core healthcare. And so you need to have a trusted relationship with the patient that's going to listen to you as you think about that offer. And you need to really be an exceptional operator to be able to kind of meet, what that sort of standard looks like. So I know I hit that briefly, but trying to give you a sense of maybe the structural issues, right, that keep the mix of patients from hitting, and some of the ways I think you ultimately kind of need to address it, but happy to go further.
Yeah, no, that was great. I mean, I was really getting at some of the mechanical issues, but I think you got back in really in some of the deeper issues, that pervade the community and pervade, history. Carolyn, did you have a question?
Yeah, you mentioned earlier that there are a lot of cooks in the kitchen when it comes to getting a clinical trial from start to finish. We've got the CROs, the sponsors, the recruiters, everyone involved. What does communication look like between all of the parties in this space?
Yeah, I don't know if an hour is going to be enough, Carolyn. Right? So again, if you assume that the primary buying pattern and the primary decision is still site-based, right? And it is, and I think it will kind of continue to be. Then you start to look at each of the channels and say, okay, how does an AMC reach out to a patient? How's a community hospital? How's a group practice? How did somebody like CVS do it? How is Walgreens, Walmart, Kroger kind of doing it as well? The short answer I'd say is there's about 7 or 8 steps to sort of the communication pattern. Broadly, you first have to make sure you can identify the patient, right? Is Jeff really the right candidate for this trial? And that's where, actually, frankly, you get into issues like interoperability and how you can really pull data from EHRs. And then you start to systematically walk your way through, okay, Jeff, I have pretty high confidences, or I have medium confidence based on the data that I have. And then you start to go through a mix of who and how you start to deliver outreach and education to that particular member. That could be a call center, that could be text, that could be email, believe it or not, it could be direct mail. But essentially each provider, each site will have sort of call it a hierarchy, right, of different outreach channels to then start to introduce the patient to the opportunity of the trial, and then to start to really kind of bring them online. And then as you get further into it, you often have what's called a screening visit, where it isn't enough just to take information, the data you have, the information you've augmented in the call, you'll often kind of need to see them as well. And that's like high level, I would say, the pattern of a site where the patient, right, let's call it a AMC for discussion purposes, right, where the patient is captive, right, or belongs or sees care there, you'll follow that kind of hierarchy. The challenge, though, right, is a lot of sites never get off the ground and aren't even able to deliver one patient. And there's probably, call it a quarter of sites that either don't get started or really significantly sort of underperform. And so what sponsors have really had to do, including, frankly, the NIH and a lot of the investigator-initiated work, is say, okay, what are the other ways we could bring new patients to bear? So outside of the physician relationship, the primary mode of getting patients onto trials is actually social media and digital, right? And so you sort of look back, and there's really notable companies, auto recruitment, Subject Well, others that do this. Last time I did a market scan, there's probably at least 150 to 200 companies whose job it is, right, either broadly through those means or through others, to sort of source and identify patients. And then you get into an entirely different workflow, because what you're trying to do is take a patient you may have found off of Instagram or Facebook ads, and you ultimately have to try and get them enrolled in the study. And there's a whole different challenge there and decision set that comes to how you deliver that outreach, but frankly, how you do that handoff off to the site in such a way that you can get the patient enrolled.
So, Tony, let me ask you, you talked about how you do that outreach and reaching out in the community and building trust. So can you talk about some of the basic blocking and tackling you did there? You were fairly new to the trial space. This was in the context of COVID. So how did you get yourself the information you needed? What did you do within the community? What groups did you reach out to? And what did that process look like?
Yeah. So listen, whether you're a retail health provider or a health plan or others, right? There's now 10 to 15 service companies I've seen doing this. The first obviously is ensuring you have a mechanism of matching a patient to a clinical trial, right? And everyone has different data and different, frankly, expertise at the process of matching that data to the right inclusion and exclusion criteria. Okay, now when you think of the community, I think the question is, do you have the trust or do you need to build the trust? And those are very different strategies and sort of very different questions, right? So someone like CVS, Walgreens, Walmart, Elevance, Optum Docs, right? You actually start, with a high degree of trust and a really strong relationship. So your build fundamentally looks different, right? It's really a question of how do I then take what might be frankly a new offer, right? Mm-hmm. Patients aren't used to sort of seeing opportunities to participate in clinical trials come in their inbox or in a letter. And so your question is really, how do I start with a foundation of trust? And then how do I introduce what's essentially a new healthcare intervention that can be for quite serious conditions in a way that is authentic and natural and respects the bounds of the relationship? So let me give you an example. If you're an independent pharmacy and you're going to send a note out for an oncology clinical trial, yes, you have a great relationship with your member, but you're probably outside the scope of what that relationship really allows you to do, right? Mm-hmm. So that's kind of both the science and the art of it. Which conditions, which patients, what are the most appropriate outreach channels? And it's really a question of how do I maintain that trust and frankly augment it and raise it even higher by being able to introduce this, I think, in a really thoughtful way. That's one. Two, this keeps going, is how do I build on that as well, right? So it's not enough, in my mind, to do that direct to patient. But clearly that was the new thing we introduced and others have really kind of built on as well. That's also where you can partner with community groups, you can do education programs. There's a lot of other efforts that can go along with that as well.
So, Tony, elaborate on that a little bit there, because I think that's where some people get stuck. What community groups did you partner with? How did you, what was the, how did you reach out to them? How did you make contact? How did you figure out which ones were going to be the ones that you worked with, and that you might even find them to be receptive?
Yeah, a lot of trial and error, and so I'd say national and a local, right? There's probably a set of national disease advocacy groups, patient advocacy groups in particular, that have this need, right? So a lot of these groups are there to help educate, and in many cases to help get new treatment options to some of their members as well. So what you find if you have some of these larger groups, there's actually a lot of companies beyond what we did that are saying, okay, I can have an ability to really help you match in some way. The second though is local, right? And so there's one thing we could do, if I'm sitting up here in Rhode Island and mapping out the 22 states we were in. The other thing though is really understanding, that call it 50-mile radius from where you are. And you can certainly think of archetypes. It could be, hey, a health system needs help. It could be there's local chapters of disease groups. It could be there's something unique to rural Louisiana versus urban New York, and there's a lot of differences there. And so I think you have to be really focused and have folks who live there or in those communities or engaged in those diseases And then you start to put together, I think, more of a hyperlocal strategy as well. The challenge though, Jeff, and I would say this is sort of the big insight for me, most standalone programs that are trying to sort of expand and educate are less effective than, frankly, structural efforts, right? Where you're saying, hey, I'm in that community, I'm deeper, I'm tied to the provider, right? So sort of saying another way, like, you're much more effective in enabling broad and diverse participation by meeting patients where they receive healthcare than you are trying to generate standalone interest, right? Through social media or local community group partnerships. You need to do both, but one can, I think, be much, much more effective than the other.
Right. Okay. Go ahead, Carolyn, and then I think we do have a question, but go ahead.
Okay, great. Well, as I am in the interoperability space, I would be remiss if I didn't ask you about your general thoughts on interoperability, particularly around clinical trials. Like, how is it important to you in this specific field of business?
Oh, geez. Many ways. And there's, I like to think of some of the use cases, right? And some of the pain points. And then I think you can start to understand a little bit better, some of those challenges, right? So one, we talked a little bit about patient recruitment and this notion of using the data that you have to ultimately map to inclusion and exclusion criteria. And if you think about it, right, you'd probably say on the lowest end, pharmacy data just gives you scripts. On the highest end, EHR probably gives you something pretty close on the structured side, right? But if you just think about an overlay disease conditions for something like a vaccine, you're probably pretty good with pharmacy into moderate EHR. Something like oncology, you need to go structured and unstructured, right? And so this first question of really, how do I just find who's really eligible for this trial before I even worry about reaching out to them, I think is a really interesting challenge. Now, when I go out, and I've spent a lot of time with health system leaders in particular, over the last few months, many of them have sort of realized they're not, they could use some help, right? This notion of how to do that specific activity is oftentimes a bit too ad hoc or a bit too manual for a lot of the coordinators. So whether you're a full-fledged AMC, whether you're what I call a site management network or SMO, or you're even what this new thing called an IRO, sort of an enablement model for health systems, you have a tremendous need, for interoperability, data linkage, and interrogation of that data to frankly unlock capacity that already exists. It's just not being utilized well, and to do so, I think, a little bit more efficiently. That's one. Two, there's tremendous challenges, and we sometimes will call them a swivel chair effect, where ultimately a pharma sponsor needs to capture data in certain systems. Those are not necessarily the systems, right, that the hospital or the physician are operating in. So when I say swivel chair, you often have what's called the clinical research coordinator, which are the true all-stars of clinical research, right? They're the ones who are really driving these practices. And they have to take the data from one system, and then they have to, transcribe it into the other, or it could be from paper into sort of these other systems as well. So there's been a lot of interesting efforts, and I know that sounds a bit wonky, right? But it's a massive pain point. One on cost, right? You're essentially paying really skilled labor to have to do this manual transcription exercise. And frankly, there's better uses of those individuals' time, right? Particularly at a time where there's labor shortages of CRCs. The second, though, is speed to study closure or lock, right? So your ability to get the data into the sponsor system gets the sponsor's time, right? So I'd say there, again, a lot of interest in some really neat companies that I think are starting to kind of take that on as well.
And I think,
I was going
to note on those too. Like the first one, I think it's been historically really difficult for all the groups I've talked to trying to create interoperability in clinical trials to match a patient, because you need to make sure they hit a certain number of qualification criteria, right? And right now, intensive reporting is the best way to do it. I'm really hopeful with like bulk fire coming out and rolling out and becoming adopted over the next couple of years. Hopefully, that is a way for this space to actually tap into interoperability, saying, I need patients who meet these things, who have these diagnoses. And the second one is also difficult because we're always trying to remove the clicks. We're always trying to remove that double documentation. So like if there is a patient encounter or an experience, that should be able to be pushed to the right folks or shared between the two separate disparate systems too. So I'm hopeful in both of those areas, but tell me about the third.
Before I even get to three, I mean, that, part of the problem, right, has been the disconnect between research programs and healthcare, right?
Mhm.
And that, without going kind of too deep sort of into that, gap, it's hard to often cut across, right? Because ultimately you have FDA, Congress is pushing the pace of FDA guidance has been incredible, but you have really FDA regulating the practice of clinical research, CMS and other bodies really driving, I think, some of the core healthcare issues they don't always meet. But I'd say over the last 18 to 24 months, really post-COVID, we've seen an incredible explosion, right, of deep interest, both on the equity side, which we talked about before with Fedora, on the DCT side, as well. But then you also have folks like the White House Office of Science Technology Policy, which is really getting in the weeds of thinking about the data linkages between research and healthcare. And I think that the intense focus you're sort of seeing from regulators on that last piece, and that was going to be my number three, is really incredible, right? Because anytime you sort of start to see regulators identify a gap like that and bring the weight of not just OSTP, ONC, and other regulatory bodies, you start to, I think, get to some really interesting outcomes as well.
So Tony, let me ask one of the questions that came in. We've got two from Shelley and one from Ted, and I'll get to one of Shelley's first. And it relates a little bit to the data in the sense of expanding clinical trials from the home to, expand access. What wrinkles does this introduce to the clinical trial process? And I assume this includes, capturing the information and getting it to the right systems, and then interoperability, as Carolyn said. And then we have one from Ted after that.
Yeah, it's a great question. Broadly, it's been really interesting in the last 3 years. During the pandemic, you had this notion of decentralized clinical trials, or DCTs. That was, I'll say, from an industry perspective, a hot market. And it cooled off, right? And even using the term DCT almost has a negative connotation if you sort of talk to sponsors, right? This notion that we had this promise of maybe technology focus or fully, non-brick and mortar based locations that failed to deliver. I would say I see it a little bit differently. We saw an incredible amount of experimentation in some of these models during the pandemic. And now we're moving to a new phase where the question is, how do I just embed some of these patient and site-centric solutions sort of into your kind of care continuum? I say that in part in context, really, Shelley, for your question, right? Because I think there's a macro of how does participation in home fit into a sponsor strategy to be both patient-centric and sort of site-centric. Mm-hmm. What I'd say is, I'm really enthused by the progress, I kind of continue to see, but it's different, right? So one could be you have dedicated home research nursing companies. Believe it or not, UPS is actually the largest provider of in-home clinical research nurses today. And you have innovative models. I'll plug one that I'm on the board of, Hawthorne Effect, where we actually have 4,000 nurses called heroes that have the ability to go in, have technology, wearables, remote monitors, everything kind of behind them, and have the ability to scale into multiple geographies and states at a given point in time. Doing work in the home is complex, right? And it's not for everybody. This is not a home care. This is not a home health company, right? It's a higher standard you need to meet kind of from an FDA perspective. And I'm really encouraged, both the dedicated and models like kind of Hawthorne, that have really shown an ability to do that, really kind of at scale. The challenge, though, is like, how do you get to adoption, right? I think we've seen that it can be done. It can be done nationally. Mm-hmm. We've seen, I think, that patients have an interest. Not all. Many of them just don't want that level of a complex visit in the home. The challenge, though, is, again, it's still at the protocol level. What you kind of need to see is the way these studies are designed need to be able to sort of have these home visits or virtual visits more systematically included in ways that matter. That's one. And two, in ways that connect to the brick and mortar sites. So it's like super interesting question, Because like you could say, okay, I'm going to bring a home health in a virtual visit, but if 8 out of 10 visits are done in a brick and mortar site, you've just introduced a whole nother measure of complexity. Is the brick and mortar site the quarterback of the in-home visits or not? And so what I think we're going through now that is so interesting is really, again, the introduction of these more patient-centric modalities into the protocol, but we haven't yet cracked how these are really going to integrate into the PI and the brick and mortar site, which is still going to be the primary driver, right? And the primary quarterback of the overall site and patient experience.
So one question, did you say the largest was UPS as in the package company?
Yes.
Wow. Okay. So let me get to
Markin Health, but yes, one of their subsidiaries. But gives you a sense of maybe, some of the complexities in logistics and distribution as well.
Okay. Can you go to Ted's question, Abby? So Ted, says the FDA seems to have indicated with draft digital clinical trials draft guidance that the trial visits can occur at the HCP, assuming means healthcare provider location, as long as these activities are routine care. Can you share your thoughts on how this will impact access and equity? And I think you've talked about that a little bit. Any thoughts on what sponsors seem to be embracing with this approach? So I think you've addressed it a little bit. I didn't know if you had anything you wanted to add there.
Yeah, Ted, thanks. I'm really excited by the FDA guidance and Jekyll, like it makes intuitive sense, right? So like the extreme example is, the oncology patient who flies right to the COE they're getting their care at just to get a blood draw and a basic visit, right? The burden that can place on patients, one, or B, the exclusion of other patient populations that don't have the means or the time to consistently travel those distances for what are frankly really kind of routine visits. Your second question, the second piece that gets interesting though is now FDA sort of saying, hey, we want this addressed, right? That's a short view of the guidance. We want to have more of these routine visits done in the community in such ways that are going to meaningfully reduce patient burden. And I think that push from regulators is incredible. The challenge is A, how do you build it? And B, how does it really sort of get adopted? So when you think a lot of site visits in particular, you start to get really in the weeds. Again, first this issue of like, what's the role of the PI versus the role of, call it a LabCorp, right?
Mm-hmm.
In doing it, or a MinuteClinic, or a Walmart Health solution, right? So you have this question of accountability that hasn't quite been worked out. And it's really, really important. All these technical issues are, because again, the quarterback of the study still takes some measure of risk, the extent to which this visit might be done sort of elsewhere in the community. So there's a couple issues like that I think on an operational perspective haven't been worked out. That's one. That second, Ted, I think sponsors that I've spoken with are excited, but also still working through, like, again, how to bring that into practice, right? Do I design my protocol differently? Are there scaled providers like lab companies or in-home phlebotomy services that can help do this for me kind of systematically? So I think one, the supply side works itself out. Two, you have these accountability questions and things like the Form 1572. And three, you have still this question of how sponsors include these routine care visits in their protocol and how the combination of these things, I think, really fit together. I'd say directionally, FDA's move is fantastic and sponsors, I think, are aligned against it. Mm-hmm. But we're now in a mode of like, okay, research is about execution. How do we really sort of figure out how to deliver it, how to integrate it into protocols, and how to ensure that there's the right level of accountability and oversight?
So let me ask one quick follow-up, and then Carolyn, I'll turn it back over to you. In your experience, Tony, you talked about, does the CRC or the PI take the lead and making these decisions? From your experience, what's the best way to structure that?
Well, I think really the only way it's the PI. FDA has been really clear about that. They're the quarterback. They take kind of accountability over the study. Full stop. I think the CRC's role is really, much like nurses in different environments, as well, is really driving, a lot of the day-to-day, particularly in less kind of complex categories. And the challenge is, frankly, how to support both, because research is incredibly complex. right? And the burden and the range of activities that's being called upon, I think, are quite broad. And that's where I think we talked about technology and the ability to better match, technology and its ability to reduce manual efforts that could take time. There's a whole series of things, and a lot of companies investing behind this notion of trying to simplify that workload to enable, I think, both better satisfaction from the site and, frankly, better efficiency from them as well.
Great. Carolyn?
Yeah, I would love to pivot a little and ask you about the business side of clinical trials. Like when I think about it and I've researched it and looked into it, I think, wow, this is a big investment if it may take 10 to 15 years to get to the end of the study when like the drug is out there and profitable. Like what does the business side of it look like? Do you consider like these research programs really R&D investments? Like how is that structured?
Yeah, so from a pharmaceutical company perspective, Carolyn, or
From any perspective, whatever is closest to your experience.
yeah, no, sure. Listen, from pharma's perspective, right, it is incredibly costly and incredibly important to bring these new therapies to life. And the way they construct, call it their portfolio of which molecules, right, they're going to invest in, could be probably its own podcast, right? But to your point, there's a range of early bets that are in what's called phase 1. Where you're really trying to get an early read with a very small patient population without knowing what safety looks like. And then the criticality, we call these phase 2 or phase 3 studies, where you're starting to get larger patient populations and you're trying to sort of figure out what they look like. And so in working with a sponsor, I mean, one, tremendously humbled, but the long-term view they have to take and the continuing rebalance of kind of risk and opportunity, particularly as things like the IRA really shift the NPV of some of these molecules, is really astounding, right? And I honestly, working on this side, I've been in healthcare services most of my career, or I focused on the reimbursement of drugs. This just gave me such a renewed and deep appreciation, for the role that sponsors have in doing this. Okay, so flip it from now trying to serve that market, right? And really, there's a bunch of different markets within it. You could be serving recruitment only. You could be serving the site investigative grant market. Let's call it, I don't know, 8 to 10 meaningful markets that sit underneath the $30-40 billion sort of market size. The challenge if you're a sponsor, and again, you have that long-term view, is the balance of, I think, innovation and risk mitigation, right? And how you sort of balance sort of the two of those. So you might have a wonderful new model, right? Let's say something like the work that we did, that folks are excited, 100 million patients you can kind of bring to bear, right? Deep community practices. Hey, that's all great, but how many studies have you run? Did you have any quality issues, right? How did that actually sort of work? And if I'm a sponsor, do I want to take a risk on a new model, even if it's a great brand, right? Even if I'm really hopeful and excited, hey, I probably do, but I'm going to be careful, right? I'm going to do a pilot. I'm going to try 1 or 2 locations, right? I'm not necessarily willing to take a bigger sort of portfolio bet on you quite yet. And so the challenge, I think, with a lot of these companies, whether you're in recruitment, whether you're in sites, whether you're serving sites, kind of go down the line, is everyone is focused on doing this better, doing whether that's from a cost basis, efficiency, speed, equity. The challenge is, so how do you match the sophistication and development of your model and the proof points that your model can really actually serve this need versus this 15-year view where folks have bet their careers and their time on getting these molecules to market. And the art of it, when you're, I think, thinking about pharma services, is nailing the intersection of the two, in a way that's responsible and respective of the sponsor needs.
Which is fascinating. Thank you.
So, Tony, you've talked about a lot of the blocking and tackling to kind of get these things right, and for people to look at that. Let me take a step back. And in the pre-call, you mentioned using expanding access and equity to connect clinical trials to value-based care, which I know is an area of interest to you. So can you kind of walk us through that, what the connection is and what you see the potential is there?
Yeah, Jeff, thank you for letting me prompt that question.
My pleasure. That's the guest prerogative, Tony.
Yeah,
So.
right. The one I really wanted to make sure I hit. There's actually two related pieces that's interesting. I'll start just really with oncology as a particular kind of use case, right? And I use that therapeutic area because you have, NCCN, kind of the cancer network guideline body, which to say research is actually usually the best option, for a patient for many of these cancers. And the challenge, and it is, I think, really interesting. Well, if that's true, right? How do you ensure that those research opportunities are offered to every patient, who may be eligible or may see that really as their best treatment option? And if it's their best treatment option, right, that means it's most likely to increase longevity, most likely to reduce total cost of care, right? I'm generalizing, right? And so taking oncology as that example, I think your first question is, how do I just remove all barriers that keep that trial from meeting that patient? So I'll give you one example, right? Medicaid beneficiaries in particular face really significant challenges, in part because up until 3 years ago, there's some cost your health plan has to pick up when you're in particular clinical trials. Medicaid didn't cover that. And Congress, with ASCO and others' help, closed that gap. What was the challenge? Well, we'll think about a Medicaid beneficiary who may not be able to participate because they don't have their ancillary costs covered. That's one. Two, unbelievably, participation in a trial could impact your eligibility for Medicaid, right? Because that is counted as income. And now there's efforts from Mural Health and others to try and address that legislatively. Give that as a couple of examples to say, okay, first, all Medicaid beneficiaries, should have all of those gaps, and issues really removed, right? It's almost outrageous, that we live in a world in which that's sort of true. So I think you can start to say, okay, what are those sort of regulatory, and or industry barriers that really kind of prevent that from happening? If you just did that, right, I think what you would find, and we see this in the research, that particularly in oncology, you could positively impact the cost and performance in some of the bundles. So if you look at some of the research from CMS, they have their oncology care model, and they did some head-to-head of patients participating versus not, and you saw it. And if you look at PubMed and do the research, there's 3 or 4 articles, happy to send them around, that find, I think, continued and consistent support for this notion that particularly in oncology, you start to see the benefits, right, in outcomes, but and elsewhere in total cost of your bundle from participating in clinical trials. Okay, now why is that? Again, I mentioned outcomes, which is the most important thing.
Yeah.
You also have another unique dynamic. When you're in a trial, it's really the sponsor providing the product, and it's not necessarily the payer, right, actually having to kind of pay for it. So depending on the therapeutic area you're in, your ideal is you get the better outcome, but you also have a bit of a tailwind from the perspective that the pharma or biotech company is providing that product as part of the trial, and that's no longer something that's going to hit the payer risk-bearing entities kind of P&L. Mm-hmm. So those TAs, the most complex, I think is where the case is strongest, right? But you'd see something really similar as you start to map therapeutic area by therapeutic area. The problem, Jeff, is like the numbers are small. And so you have this sort of balance where an individual payer may not see enough benefit. And so we're a little bit stuck where I think the case for value-based care in research is strong for certain TAs, but the numbers are small enough that it's been hard, I think, to get people really excited about leaning into it more.
That's really interesting, particularly in the case of oncology. We've done some work with the Community Oncology Alliance, and some of the things you see with that is really interesting. Let me get to Nate's question, and then Carolyn, I will turn it over to you for the last question. So Nate, we're going to have to go at a slightly higher level here, but it sounds like Nate is a former colleague, and he's asking, what are some of the learnings you've reflected on as it relates to engaging large retailers around the long-term views they have to take to be successful within the clinical trial industry? So I know, Tony, you cannot comment on CVS particular, but I'm going to take Nate's question up a level. We have seen Walgreens recently close some of the Village MD sites. Walmart yesterday suggested they're going to slow the pace of some of their openings. with their clinics. We've seen Amazon have issues. And I'm not picking on anybody in particular, but it does seem like retailers in general, very broadly, not singling out anybody, may need to take a little longer term view. Can you talk about retailers and alternative entrants in healthcare, and maybe about what they're realizing and why they may need a longer term view without focusing on anybody specific?
Yeah, of course. And I did not plant that one, but Nate, it's always good to hear from you. And Jeff is a big Red Sox fan as well, Nate. So you guys have that in common.
Absolutely. 5-2 so far. Big surprise.
It is a surprise. It really depends on what you're trying to accomplish. So let's take patient recruitment. Right? It's a $2 to $4 billion market. It's very high margin. It's also one of patient need, right? We talked about it. Patients just aren't seeing those opportunities, even though they'd really like to. And I'd say there, the evidence is clear. If you have a trusted relationship, and you have the right data to match inclusion and exclusion criteria, it can be very effective. We saw that Walgreens, Walmart, have all seen it, and it's very clear, right? The question, I think, for any retailer, and I pull it up and say any service company, is how does that relate to your view of the value you're there to provide for your member? It could be financial, the LTV of the member, right? It could be, hey, where do I have the right to offer different services? But you can be successful in recruitment, but just because you can doesn't mean you should. And getting to should is really a question of understanding the role of research relative to your strategy. So if you believe, right, that again, attacking these deeply problematic issues in equity and access ties to what you're doing in such a way that is respectful of the natural contours of the trusted relationship that you have, then you just have to be really focused of ensuring those things are really kind of tied together. The second market is a little bit different, right? And you think about what's called I'll call the site or investigator grant market, right? The folks really running the clinical trials. Let's say that's a $15 to $18 billion market. Probably half of that, 2/3 is in AMCs, the other half is in a range of other providers. So the question of somebody coming in, the first question is, can we do better with existing capacity or not? We covered that before. There's enormous opportunity to better use AMCs, health systems, and sites. Okay, so if you're going to come in new, Jeff, right, the question is, and you're going to say, I'm going to bring new capacity online. I think the first thing is, well, what is your healthcare delivery strategy, right? And to your point, you've seen a lot of maybe pullbacks, from some of the names that you actually kind of mentioned. The only thing I would say is if you're going to run studies, you have to be really locked in on what the delivery strategy looks like, and then how research kind of fits in, right? Because there's choices. Am I just going to build brand new sites? Well, are retailers the best people to just build brand new sites, right? Well, if I'm going to integrate it, well, what is my clinic strategy? What's my primary care strategy? And then am I building a model that enables those to offer research, or am I building a different way for them to kind of raise revenue? So in that second model, again, it's one, do you want to be in the site business, right? Two, you got to recognize the significant challenges and barriers to being in it. Three, you have to have a really tight view of your primary care and your healthcare delivery strategy. And then you have to take a long view. If you can say yes to all of those things, right? I want to be in it. I think it's the right thing to do. I know where I'm going on delivery. I see how this is additive. Then you just have to take a long view, and you absolutely have the ability to win, but it doesn't happen overnight. It absolutely will take time to show that effectiveness.
I particularly love the phrase, just because you can doesn't mean you should. So maybe lifelong advice in a number of areas. So Carolyn, do you want to finish out with Tony? Any last questions?
Sure, I'll do my favorite wrap-up question. Tony, take out your crystal ball. What do you see as the future of clinical trials? Where do you see the space going?
I'll focus on the delivery side. Yeah, I think you're going to see my further out 5 to 10 is a revolution in how AMCs and providers operate in and think about clinical research. Right, almost all the market activity right? And honestly, 500 plus companies just in the segments we've talked about are focused on independent or augmenting. But I think if you believe, right, research is still going to get tied to your provider, I think the real activity over time is going to be how you enable that to get done more effectively, more efficiently, more diversely, right, in those markets. I think that's going to be, that's probably the big one.
That's great, Tony. Thank you. Always a pleasure, and really appreciate your time and your thoughtfulness. And look forward to catching up again in person in the not too distant future.
That sounds great. Jeff, Carolyn, thanks for the time.
Thanks, Tony.
Thank you.
See you guys.
So with that, we will turn it over to our discussion articles. And so, Carolyn, I will introduce the first one. Actually, I will introduce both since I'm going to let you take more of the answer in the second one. I'll give you a little time to think about your answer on that one then. So Medicare Advantage plans to see 2025 a base pay fall. This was an article from Axios. The Biden administration on Monday announced its proposal to cut next year's base payments to Medicare Advantage plans an average of 0.16%, despite pressure from their allies in Congress and the plans themselves. Overall, the plans will, don't worry about the plans, folks. They will see a net 3.7% increase. This news did send the shares of United Health, CVS, Humana, Centene falling amid the pressure. It's really a reflection of what's going on overall in the environment, because CMS is making adjustments to risk adjustment scores and others and such things as the hierarchical condition categories. And what's happening here, without getting too wonky, is CMS will be phasing in a mix of the 2020 and 2024 risk adjustment factors over 2024, 2025, and 2026. More than half of Medicare enrollees now get their coverage from Medicare Advantage plans. Experts say they are typically overpaid and they cost taxpayers, some experts, let me say that, tens of billions of dollars more than they should, because the plans tend to, according to these experts, upcode and make additional adjustments to the risk coding. For those of you who don't know, Medicare Advantage has the right to do home visits to look at the risk coding, as well as they can, when they go to see Medicare Advantage patients, readjust the risk coding, this so-called HCC coding. And the bigger picture issue, though, is, and we've talked about this a number of times, insurers are dealing with higher benefit costs due to deferred care from COVID as patients catch up on care post-pandemic, and due to these risk adjustments that CMS is making to the HCC categories, as well as to some of the pharma products. So we do think that MA will continue to be under pressure. It's something that bears watching because they will look to other areas to try to help, including IT spend and others, to try to help, mitigate some of those costs and look to be more efficient. Thoughts on this particular article, Carolyn?
There's this one outstanding question in my mind after reading this. To me, it just sounds like this back and forth of, hey, we want to better accurately provide the right amount of plan payments to you. And these healthcare companies are saying, hey, I forecast based on what you have said historically, we will be paid to run these Medicare Advantage programs. Who is going to win this back and forth, Jeff? Do you think that with these changes and these risk adjusted payments, do you think it will really result in more even distribution, or do you think it will really throw those major health companies for a loop in the way that they have been planning for and supporting Medicare Advantage?
Well, I do think about the phrase that someone once said. I'm see if I can remember it correctly. On Wall Street, you generally go from absolutely wonderful to absolutely terrible in the blink of an eye. In the real world, things moved a little bit more gradually. And I do think that the stocks probably overreacted, from my experience, that you're just getting more balance. For years, the Medicare Advantage plans have done very well. There probably has been some degree of upcoding. And I do think you're getting back to a better balance. Will it kill the Medicare plans per se? No. Will it help reduce some of the imbalance? I absolutely think so. And I do just think you're getting a more balanced operating environment.
Awesome.
So now the next question, which is right in your wheelhouse, Carolyn. So I'm going to tee this up. I'll let you answer, then I'll add my comments. So this was an article, and I'm sorry, I apologize. I forget where. I know Abby's going to cue it up. Protecting patient data sharing and ownership with ethical data use. And the article makes the point that as consumerism has gripped the healthcare industry, the medical industry has seen growing prominence of patient data sharing. And there's a number of issues you have to deal with. And the idea is they're working to, quote unquote, crack the code as they adapt to this new model of care. And part of the issue is you have so much data, but you struggle to analyze it and turn it into something that's usable. Part of what Redox does, frankly. And how do you turn that into insight and turn it into, for example, training set data for AI? And then how do you take it and turn it into data like digital biomarkers that can be helpful in assessing patient risk and determining more personalized care? And as an analyst, I believe she was from Forrester, who had made the point, it's not just about patients who can share it, but do they have the right to revoke access? For example, for a patient who has moved doctors or moved hospitals, I no longer want that particular hospital to have access or use my patient data for AI training records. So I think this is going to require a lot of patient education, as the analyst said, a lot of work around informed consent, and kind of gets to what Tony said about cultivating trust and ensuring patients know about the safeguards that are in place to protect patient privacy and patient data. So Carolyn, this is right in your wheelhouse. I will let you go ahead.
Yeah, there's a lot to sink your teeth into here. I think I'll start with just the concept of a patient owning their healthcare data. This is still very new, right? Like everyone, I think most people are universally in agreement that a patient should own when and how they share their data. There's concepts of having a patient-owned database of their healthcare in the hosted in the cloud that you can share across different providers and different systems. The reality is not a lot of that is in place yet. A lot of it doesn't exist yet. That patient authorization use case is still very fresh. And historically, it's these organizations who take on the lift of storing and protecting patient health information. There are so many rules and regulations, HIPAA, rules around you need to have specific agreements in place with entities that you do exchange data with, even in order just to exchange it, to ensure that kinds of trust, to ensure that you understand who has liability in the event of a breach or in the event of an issue. So there's so much liability around the organizations who own the data right now and have to keep it and share it and protect it. They have to be extremely careful with sharing it. The reality of today is you go into a doctor's office, you might have to sign a release of information form or a willingness to share. And this could even just be if you're going to a specialist and the specialist needs to be able to confirm that they can send data back to your PCP or something like that. When we think about there's all these use cases, there's a ton of patient data out there. There's enough places where we can send this patient data where a patient should be able to own and transfer that. There are still just so many rules around releasing your information. And there are also so many disparate places where your patient information lives. I've lived in California, I've lived in Wisconsin. I have healthcare information in Wisconsin and in California that I think is lined up, but I'm not totally sure, right? Because I haven't seen the full picture or the full chart, because it's in two different places owned by two different entities. So to be able to move into this place of a patient truly being able to share their data, have that ownership, there has to be a whole infrastructure change, in my opinion, a whole new rules and regulations around verifying you are the patient you say you are to be able to get and exchange your data, and a ton of patient education around what these rules are, what this could mean. Like, does every patient need to become like HIPAA trained to understand like how valuable and important your data is to or to not be shared? Like, there are questions there. And you also talked about like AI modeling and stuff, and I see that more going in a way of like entities who already own data, de-identifying that and moving that into AI models. Like, I see a lot of like de-identification tooling becoming more prominent and out there, and I can see that being very, very useful for like research use cases, AI modeling use cases, and those applications of AI, more so than a patient self-selecting into supporting those kinds of use cases. So those are my initial thoughts. Jeff, anything that any questions there? Any thoughts you have?
I have two other thoughts before I wrap it up. One, I think you hit on a good point. Kind of a restructuring, and I think around really two areas in terms of patient consent. One is, most documents are supposed to be written at, I think it's either a 6th or 8th grade level. I would argue that most documents are not. Most of the healthcare documents that I've gotten and that I've run through a reader are typically written at a 10th or 11th grade level. The other thing is, I think much more work and much more time and attention has to be paid to informed consent. Oftentimes, it's kind of just brushed over in the office. Oh, here, just sign this. This means this. You're not given any opportunity to read it. You're not told what you're signing. You're not told what rights you're giving away. I think healthcare organizations, much the same way they used to work with food labels, needs to be really designed much better. But I think we'll come revisit this. But so with that, I will wrap it up. I know we're running up against time. I did want to thank you. I did want to thank Nate, Ted, and Shelley for their questions. As I said, I'm Jeff Englander. I am the founder and principal of the Healthcare Strategy Bullpen. We help providers and payers adapt and deploy healthcare tech to improve the lives of patients. We also help health tech innovators be more effective in developing and deploying their technology with healthcare providers and payers throughout the delivery ecosystem. We focus on 4 areas: operationalizing data to maximize its analytical value, demonstrating the benefits of new applications enabled by digital health, applying digital health to high cost and chronic conditions, and helping you gauge and manage some of the practical, cultural, and technological issues around the social determinants of health. Please check out the RPM Market Landscape Report, which is on our website, healthcarebullpen.com, under the Products and Webcast tab. And please join us on April 18th, when our guest will be Jenny Shulkin, the CEO of Override Health, who will talk about non-opioid pain management. And with that, I will turn it over to you, Carolyn, to close us out.
Great. Our show is also sponsored by Redox, the healthcare integration platform that specializes in the implementation of big data, AI, cloud computing, you name it. Be sure to subscribe to Diagnosing Healthtech on any podcast forum, or just scan the QR code that's up there to get updates. From all of us at Diagnosing Healthtech, thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you next time.
Take care. Thanks very much.